Inside the halls of Congress, Jasmine Crockett dares to confront Donald Trump with one unthinkable secret, questions surrounding Barron's bloodline that could shatter everything. For 20 years, more than $400,000 kept the truth locked away. Now, under the blinding lights of power, science and lies collide, and within 60 seconds, Trump is struck into absolute silence. What devastating secret did Jasmine reveal? One powerful enough to bring the strongest empire in America crashing down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that carried weight. Every gaze, sharp and unblinking, was fixed on Trump, who sat at the witness table like he owned it. He leaned back in his chair, his chin raised in defiance, and a smirk slashed across his face. With a slow, deliberate sneer, he spoke into the microphone. "This Crockett woman is here to put on a show. I've had enough lies to last me a lifetime." The words dripped with disdain, landing like poison in the still air. The tension spiked instantly, the room bracing for impact. The heavy doors swung open, and Jasmine Crockett entered with unshakable calm. She didn't glance at the crowd, didn't break stride. Her focus was a straight line locked on Trump. In her hands, a sealed folder, thick, heavy, dangerous, gleamed under the overhead lights. She carried it not like paperwork, but like evidence meant to cut through armor. Her eyes were cold steel, her steps deliberate, each echo ringing like a warning shot across marble floors. Trump's smirk twitched, just for a breath. Then he forced it back, mocking her presence with narrowed eyes. At the front, the committee chair lifted his gavel and slammed it down, the crack jolting the chamber. His voice cut through the standoff with solemn force. "This hearing is convened to expose evidence tied to bloodline and concealed political power." The words thundered into the silence, framing the battle lines for all to see. Around the room, lawmakers shifted in their seats, the unease visible, as if they knew this was no ordinary clash. Every second carried the weight of history, and there was no escape from what was about to unfold. The air thickened as Jasmine placed the folder onto the table with a deliberate thud, the sound sharp, final, unignorable. Her hand lingered on it like she was holding down a live fuse, daring anyone to move it. Trump scoffed, shaking his head with theatrical boredom, muttering just loud enough to be heard. "Pathetic." A circus act. But the tight curl of his fist on the armrest betrayed the crack beneath the bravado. The opening shots had been fired, and the war for truth had begun. The weight of the chamber pressed down like a storm waiting to break. After the committee chair's words still echoed through the walls, Jasmine moved with deliberate calm, her hands steady as she opened the thick folder in front of her. The simple sound of paper sliding free cut through the air, sharper than any shout. Every lawmaker, every aide, every staffer leaned forward in instinct, their eyes narrowing to catch even the smallest detail of what she would reveal. Then, in a voice steady but ringing with steel, she held the page aloft and declared, "This is an independent blood test comparing Donald Trump and Barron Trump. The result? No direct biological relation." The chamber froze for half a heartbeat before gasps and murmurs erupted, as though the very air had been cracked open. It was no longer speculation, no longer rumor. This was science being laid bare under the brightest lights of power. Trump reacted instantly, his body jerking forward like a coiled spring unleashed. He laughed, loud, mocking, almost desperate in its sharpness, letting the sound ricochet off the chamber walls like an attack. He slapped his palm hard against the polished wood of the desk, the microphone quivering under the impact. His voice followed, booming with contempt. "What a joke! I'll have my lawyers tear you apart for slander." The words were wrapped in confidence, but his eyes betrayed something different. A darting flicker, the look of a man cornered yet trying to pretend the cage wasn't closing in. His laughter rolled across the room, but it didn't land as he intended. It wasn't commanding, it wasn't convincing. It was the laugh of a man trying to choke back fear. Jasmine's face didn't shift. She didn't blink, didn't recoil. Her hand pressed the document flat against the table with a firm certainty, her eyes locked on Trump as though daring him to move an inch closer. Then her voice cut through the noise, low but sharp enough to slice the tension into shreds. This isn't a game. 3 independent laboratories, 3 identical results, all notarized and certified under law. The Johns Hopkins Forensic Genetics Lab in Baltimore, the Mayo Clinic Genetic Testing Unit in Minnesota, and the Stanford DNA Research Center in California. Each working separately, each reaching the same conclusion. Donald Trump and Barron Trump share no direct biological relation. Each word struck like a hammer against iron, deliberate and undeniable. The official seals gleamed under the lights, signatures sprawled across the margins, each mark a nail sealing the truth into the record. The crowd of lawmakers leaned even further forward, the disbelief in their faces now laced with a flicker of dread. They weren't just hearing claims. They were staring at authenticated evidence that had nowhere to hide. Trump tried to seize the stage back. He leaned in his chair, spreading his arms wide like a showman desperate to distract. Then he began clapping, slow, exaggerated, venomous. The hollow rhythm of his palms echoed mockingly in the chamber, dripping with disdain. His grin widened, but it stretched too far, straining like a mask about to crack. With a voice oozing sarcasm, he spat, "Bravo, Crockett! Maybe you missed your calling. You should write movie scripts instead of wasting time here." His laughter came again, forced and jagged, bouncing awkwardly off the cold stairs surrounding him. He wanted to frame this as theater, to make her look like a performer. But the irony was plain. Every eye in the room knew who was really acting. The power in the room had shifted, and no amount of mock applause could drown out the sound of a truth that had just been spoken into existence. The chamber was alive now, humming with the charge of revelation. The first strike had been made, undeniable and fierce, and though Trump clawed at the edges with mockery and threats, his arrogance rang thinner by the second. The science stood unshaken, and in that moment it was Trump, not Jasmine, who looked like the actor on a collapsing stage. The chamber was still buzzing from the sting of the DNA evidence when Jasmine reached back into the folder, her movements crisp, deliberate, almost surgical. She pulled out another set of papers, thicker than the last, the kind of documents that carried the weight of years hidden in shadows. Her eyes locked on Trump as she spoke, her tone steady but edged with fire. "These are internal emails from 2005. They show Donald Trump secretly transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars to suppress original DNA results." Then she lowered the hammer with details that silenced every whisper in the room. On June 14, 2005, a wire transfer of $250,000 was sent to Dr. Leonard McHale, the attending physician who first conducted the genetic test. 2 months later, on August 3rd, another $175,000 payment was sent through a shell company to Dr. Raymond Sloan, a consultant brought in to verify the results. Both payments were made under contracts marked confidential services, but the attached correspondence makes it clear. These funds were to keep the truth buried. The words hit like thunder rolling across the chamber, shaking its walls with the sound of corruption spelled out in numbers, names, and dates. Trump's smirk disintegrated into rage, his body snapping forward as his hand crashed onto the desk. The violent boom echoed through the microphones, rattling the glass of water before him. His voice exploded into the chamber, a mixture of fury and desperation. "Enough! These emails are fake. Security! Remove her now!" The command sliced the room like a blade, and in an instant, 2 security officers strode forward, their footsteps heavy, their eyes locked on Jasmine. Trump jabbed his finger toward her like a man pointing at an enemy he couldn't defeat any other way. His anger, which once played as arrogance, now bled into panic, the desperation of someone watching the walls of denial crumble. Jasmine didn't flinch. She rose straight-backed, lifting the papers high so every lawmaker could see the seals, the letterheads, the undeniable codes of authenticity etched into the margins. Her voice rang out, cold and cutting through the charged air. "This is the original record. Digitally certified, directly extracted from the medical archive system. Every signature, every code is authenticated." The officers hesitated mid-step, glancing at each other, their discipline cracking under the weight of what stood before them. The document wasn't just ink, it was a weapon, a truth heavier than their orders. The committee chair slammed the gavel, the strike sharp as gunfire. His voice carried command and finality. "Stand down. She will continue." The security froze, then slowly withdrew, leaving Jasmine unshaken, standing firm in the storm she had unleashed. Trump's face twitched, his breathing uneven, the veneer of control slipping away. For the first time, his eyes betrayed it. Fear, raw and unguarded, crawling into the open where the whole nation could see. The attempt to silence her had collapsed, and in its failure, Trump's mask cracked, the illusion of power torn apart by hard numbers and the unrelenting voice of truth. The chamber felt like it was holding its breath when Jasmine slowly turned her gaze toward the side door. Her voice rang out, steady and commanding. "Bring in the witness." The tall wooden doors opened with a low groan, and the sound alone was enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. Stepping through was Nurse Evelyn Carter, the woman who had served in the neonatal unit at New York Presbyterian Hospital in 2005, present during the original collection of Barron Trump's DNA. Her frame was slight, her shoulders tense, but the gravity of her entrance shifted the air instantly. Every pair of eyes followed her as though the truth itself had just walked into the chamber. She moved down the aisle in small measured steps, her heels tapping against the marble floor, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. Her hands were clasped in front of her chest, knuckles tight, betraying nerves, yet her chin lifted higher with each step. When she reached the witness stand, she raised her right hand to take the oath. Her voice wavered at first, catching in her throat, but she forced it through, firming on the last syllable. By the time she lowered her hand, she was breathing heavier, but she stood straighter, like someone who knew retreat was no longer possible. The chamber was frozen, every sound magnified. A pen dropped somewhere in the gallery, and the clatter ricocheted like thunder. Evelyn placed her hands on the table in front of her, steadying them against the polished wood. For a long moment, her eyes flickered across the room, then finally landed on Jasmine. The Congresswoman gave her a small nod, and the nurse drew in a deep breath, summoning words that had been chained in silence for years. Her voice, fragile yet piercing, filled the hall. "I was forced to sign a non-disclosure, but I remember clearly. The results showed no father-son relationship." The words fell like a blade slicing through the chamber. Gasps rippled across the audience. Some lawmakers instinctively leaned back, while others bent forward, eyes wide as if needing to see her lips move again, to believe it. Evelyn's hands trembled, but her voice did not falter. She lifted her head higher, as though bracing herself against the storm she knew was coming. Her next words landed even heavier. "It was Mr. Trump's personal attorney, Michael Reynolds, who shoved the papers in front of me. He told me if I didn't sign, I would lose my job, my medical license would be stripped, and I would be sued into ruin. I signed, but I never forgot what I saw." The impact was electric. The accusation didn't just suggest cover-up. It spelled out coercion, blackmail, the silencing of truth through fear. The lawmakers on the dais shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances that betrayed unease, others looking down at their notes as though afraid to meet her eyes. The audience behind the barrier whispered in a low wave, the kind of sound that felt more dangerous than shouting. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with the knowledge that a 20-year-old secret had just been dragged into the light. The eruption came instantly. Trump shoved his chair backward, the legs shrieking across the floor with a metallic screech that stabbed into the tense silence. He bolted upright, his face burning red, fists slamming down so hard on the desk that the microphones rattled and a glass of water nearly toppled. His voice exploded in a roar that echoed off the marble walls. "Traitor! You were bought!" The accusation rang out, filled with fury, but beneath the surface was a rawness that betrayed panic. His finger jabbed the air toward Evelyn, a wild, desperate gesture more like an attack than an argument. No one answered him. The chamber didn't rally, didn't echo his words. The lawmakers stayed rigid in their seats, frozen in the weight of what had been said. His rage filled the room, but it was hollow, bouncing off walls that now belonged to someone else. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't rise, didn't shout. She turned her head slowly, her gaze like ice locking on Trump. And when she spoke, her voice carried with lethal precision, "You can buy silence, but you cannot buy memory." The sentence cracked across the chamber like a verdict, final and absolute. The nurse's eyes welled, not with fear but with release, as if the words had unshackled her from decades of enforced quiet. She drew in a long, shaky breath, shoulders falling as the weight she had carried bled away. The entire chamber held still, stunned into silence by the collision of testimony and truth. For the first time in the hearing, Trump's fury wasn't met with deference or fear. It stood exposed, hollow against the immovable weight of memory. The room no longer belonged to his rage. It belonged to her truth, and the silence that followed was heavier than any roar. The chamber was already a furnace of tension when Trump snapped. His body lurched forward, his palm cracked against the desk so hard the microphones rattled, and his face twisted in rage. His fingers stabbed the air at Jasmine as his voice thundered through the room, raw and cruel. "You are trash. This Congress is not for a woman like you." The insult ricocheted across the marble walls, ugly and venomous, meant to crush her spirit in front of the nation. For a heartbeat, the hall went deathly silent, every ear ringing with the violence of his words, every gaze locked on Jasmine to see if she would break. She didn't move. She stood unshaken, her jaw set, her eyes locked on him with unflinching steel. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the silence like a blade of ice. "You can shout, you can curse my name, but you cannot erase the truth staring you in the face." The sentence struck harder than his roar, turning the atmosphere on its axis. The air no longer belonged to his fury. It belonged to her defiance. Then slowly and deliberately, Jasmine reached into her folder. Her fingers closed on a thick, bound financial report, heavy with 2 decades of rot, the embossed seals shining under the lights like iron chains no one could snap. She lifted it high, letting the chamber see the evidence in her grip, then laid it flat on the desk with a sound like a gavel. Her voice sharpened, precise and merciless. On July 22, 2005, Donald Trump authorized a payment of $400,000 to Dr. Henry Walters, director of New York Presbyterian Hospital, where Barron Trump was born. The memo line read, "Restricted retainer." In truth, this was not a retainer at all. It was money to silence him, to buy his loyalty, to keep him from ever speaking of the original DNA results. She pressed her hand flat against the page, her palm covering Walter's signature and the cleared transaction code as if daring anyone to deny it. The reaction was visceral. Gasps broke from the audience. Lawmakers stiffened in their chairs and aides froze mid-note. The words weren't rumor or speculation. They were tied to names, dates, and an institution whose walls had stood for over a century. This wasn't a whisper anymore. This was proof carved into paper, stained with the ink of power and corruption. But Jasmine wasn't finished. From her folder, she pulled a small recorder, black and unassuming, then pressed play. The static hiss filled the air for a second, and then a voice emerged, deep, familiar, unmistakable. Trump's own words, preserved like a time bomb waiting to detonate. "Henry, you'll get the $400,000 directly. Keep your name clean, keep your mouth shut, and this never leaves your office." His voice echoed across the chamber, cold, transactional, and damning. The recording replayed the bargain not as speculation, but as living sound. Words that had hidden in the dark for almost 20 years, now blasting under the brightest lights in the nation. The room froze. The gasp this time was deeper, heavier, and then silence crushed down like a weight. The lawmakers sat rigid, their eyes darting between Jasmine, the report, and the man who had just condemned himself with his own voice. Even the guards along the wall stiffened, their faces betraying shock they could not contain. Trump's roar had filled the chamber minutes earlier. Now his own voice was the weapon turned against him. Trump clenched his fists, his jaw twitching as though he wanted to spit venom, but nothing he could say would erase what they had just heard. His face was fire, his eyes wild, but behind the blaze lay something more dangerous. Panic. The cover-up had lived in shadows for nearly 20 years, protected by power and money. Now in seconds it had been dragged into the light, undeniable, irreversible. His fury, once his shield, had become his undoing. The harder he raged, the more desperate he looked. Every shout, every insult, every flicker of anger only stripped away his mask. For the first time, The chamber did not see a man in command. They saw a man cornered, exposed by the truth he had tried and failed to bury with $400,000 and the weight of his name. Just when it seemed the storm had reached its peak, Jasmine calmly reached for the one weapon that would cut deeper than any document. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the final folder resting at her side. The sound of the clasp snapping open sliced through the silence like a blade. Every head in the room turned as she drew out a single document, bound in protective cover, its cream-colored paper aged but unblemished, stamped with the deep red ink of authority. It was more than paper. It was a verdict in waiting. The room seemed to draw inward, shrinking around that piece of evidence before she even revealed its contents. Jasmine placed the document on the desk before her, smoothing the surface with her hand, and then lifted it high into the light. Her gaze cut across the chamber, unwavering. Her voice, low but sharp as iron, carried effortlessly into every corner. This is the original birth certificate of Barron William Trump, extracted directly from the archives of the state of New York. The words landed like thunder. No speculation, no story. The state itself had spoken through ink, seal, and signature. Her eyes dropped to the page as she began to read, her tone measured like a judge delivering sentence. Child information, full name, Barron William Trump. Date of birth, March 20th, 2006. Time of birth, 5:30 in the morning. Place of birth, New York Presbyterian Hospital, Manhattan, New York. Each line echoed clinical and unassailable, the cold weight of bureaucracy speaking louder than any accusation. No one stirred. Not a cough, not a whisper. It was the sound of truth asserting itself. Then Jasmine's voice hardened as she moved to the section that mattered most. Parent information, father's name, Ales Novak, citizen of Slovenia, a small businessman legally residing in the United States at the time. Father's place of birth, Ljubljana, Slovenia. Mother's name, Melania Knaus Trump, maiden name Knaus. Mother's place of birth, Novo Mesto, Slovenia. The chamber gasped collectively, the shock cascading through the rows like a wave breaking against stone. The words struck harder than any argument could, the revelation snapping through the silence with the finality of a gunshot. Trump's name was absent. In its place, another man stood bold, black ink on cream-colored paper, impossible to erase. Jasmine let the silence stretch, forcing the weight of that fact to sink into every mind present. She looked up, straight into Trump's eyes, and continued with merciless clarity. Registrar information, filed March 23, 2006, signed by Margaret Hill, Director of Vital Records, State of New York. She lifted the document slightly higher, turning it under the chamber lights. Here you can see the embossed seal of the Department of Health. Here, the red ink stamp of New York City's Vital Records Office. And here, faint but unmistakable, the security watermark running through the paper. These are the protections designed so that no one can alter or forge what you see before you. And on the line marked father's name, it does not say Donald J. Trump. It says Ales Novak, Slovenian citizen, small businessman, lawful resident. This is the truth you buried with hundreds of thousands of dollars. The words rang out like steel, and the chamber erupted into a chorus of gasps and murmurs, the noise swelling and then collapsing again into a stunned hush. All eyes snapped back to Trump. He did not rise. He did not roar. His body was rigid, his face drained of color, his lips working silently, searching for words that refused to form. His hands twitched against the table, fingers clenching and unclenching, but his eyes never left the bottom of the document where the registrar's signature and the state seal glared back at him. It was as if the paper itself was a mirror, showing him not just the truth he had buried, but the inevitability of his downfall. His whole life had been bluster, denial, and deflection. But a birth certificate was none of those things. It was a stone carved by law, untouched for 17 years, and now it stood as an executioner he could not silence. The lawmakers around him shifted uneasily, some leaning forward as if to make sure their eyes had not deceived them, others sinking back in their chairs as though the floor itself had tilted. The aides froze. pens hovering inches above their notepads, incapable of recording anything more. Even the guards at the far end of the room were still, their eyes flicking to the document and then to the man they were supposed to protect, unsure what protection could mean in a moment like this. Trump's mouth opened, a stammer catching in his throat, but no sound emerged. He blinked rapidly, his chest heaving, as though the air itself refused to enter his lungs. For the first time in the hearing, he looked small. His usual fire, the insults, the roars, the sneers, was gone. What remained was a man staring at ink he could not deny, ink that had outlived every bribe and threat. The silence that filled the chamber was suffocating. It pressed down on the lawmakers, on the aides, on the audience watching from the gallery. It stretched and stretched until it became unbearable, until the tension felt like it would split the very walls. No one moved. No one dared speak. The truth had frozen them all in place, as though the chamber itself was holding its breath. And then Jasmine's voice broke the silence. She lowered the document slightly, her eyes never leaving Trump's, her words cutting sharp and cold. You can buy silence. You can issue threats. You can muzzle an entire hospital. But an original birth certificate with a father's name, a seal, and a lawful signature does not lie. Her voice reverberated off the walls, echoing like the crack of a judge's gavel. There was no shout in her tone, no need for fury. The calmness was sharper than any scream could ever be. It was final. It was absolute. Trump didn't move, didn't speak. His shoulders sagged, his face slack, the weight of inevitability crushing him where he stood. The chamber saw it, his mask shattering, his defenses crumbling, the power he had wielded collapsing into dust before their eyes. And in that silence, it was clear. The second climax had arrived. Donald Trump was finished, not by shouts or accusations, but by a single sheet of paper, stamped and sealed, a truth that had waited 17 years to break free. He stood exposed, stripped bare, silent and broken before Congress, with nowhere left to run. The chamber still reeled from the detonation of the truth. The sound of Trump's own silence hung in the air longer than any roar he had ever unleashed. What had moments earlier been a hall of defiance and verbal combat was now a space filled with the suffocating stillness of finality. Every figure in the room, from the lawmakers seated shoulder to shoulder to the aides who clutched their notepads in trembling hands, was locked in disbelief. It was as though the oxygen had thinned, as though the truth itself had stolen their breath. The silence was not empty. It was alive, a force pressing down on every chest, whispering one unescapable reality. There was no way back. Eyes darted across the chamber. Some senators leaned close to whisper to each other, though their words never quite made it past their lips. Their faces told enough: shock, disbelief, the uneasy dawning of a new reality. Others simply stared straight ahead, unable to move, unwilling to break the trance of what had just unfolded before them. They were men and women who had seen scandals before, lies before, betrayals before. But this was something different. This was not rumor or allegation. This was the stone-carved truth, sealed with signatures, stamps, and Trump's own voice damning him. The weight of history pressed in, the mahogany desks, the high-vaulted ceiling, the flags hanging silent in the corners. Suddenly all of it seemed transformed into a witness stand. The chamber itself had become a cathedral of truth, and every soul inside was a stunned congregant. They had not come to watch a debate. They had come unknowingly to watch an empire of arrogance collapse in real time. A ripple ran through the room, subtle at first, the quiet shifting of feet, the soft scrape of a chair. Then the ripple grew heavier, a low wave of gasps and murmurs as lawmakers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The truth was too heavy to keep to themselves, too shocking to internalize without reaction. Some clasped their hands tightly on the desk before them, knuckles white with the strain of disbelief. Others sat back, rigid, as though retreating into themselves to process the enormity of what had been revealed. Each face was a mirror of the same thought. This cannot be real. And yet it is. Then, cutting through the thick fog of silence, came the sharp, resonant crack of the gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the still chamber, snapping spines upright, pulling heads toward the dais where the chairman sat with his eyes like steel. The strike of wood against wood was not just procedural, it was final, a seal pressed onto the moment. The room stilled even further, if such a thing were possible, as the chairman's voice followed. Calm but thunderous, his words carved into the air with an authority that left no cracks. The truth has been proven. No one has the right to deny it. The sentence landed with a weight equal to the evidence itself. It was not just a declaration, it was a verdict. The chamber shook with the gravity of it, though no walls crumbled and no lights flickered. The collapse was inward, personal, political. The lawmakers bowed their heads, acknowledging the inevitability. Some shut their eyes as if to burn the words into memory. Others gripped their pens with trembling fingers, desperate to record history even as they lived it. And there, in the eye of the storm, sat Donald J. Trump. The man who had once turned every room into his stage, every challenge into his spotlight, was now reduced to stillness. His body did not move, save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He sat frozen, as if the chair itself had claimed him, rooting him to the spot. For years he had thrived on defiance, on the energy of rage and spectacle. But in this moment, none of that remained. His eyes, once so alive with arrogance and fire, had gone hollow. They stared not at the chairman, not at Jasmine, not at the lawmakers now staring back at him. They stared inward, into the abyss of a man who had spent decades building walls of bluster, only to watch them collapse in a single afternoon. His lips trembled, faintly, mumbled movements that shaped no sound, as though he were trying to summon excuses, denials, words. But they would not come. They could not come. Even he knew that. The chamber watched him, unblinking, their silence harsher than any shouted condemnation could have been. There was no applause, no jeering, no victory cries, just the crushing recognition of what lay before them. A man unmade, a legacy collapsing, a name once untouchable, now shackled to evidence so unyielding it could never again be denied. One senator leaned back, exhaling sharply through his nose, his eyes narrowing as though measuring the sheer immensity of the fall. Another rubbed her temple, her hands shaking, as if trying to erase the memory but knowing it would never leave her. The staffers shifted uneasily, pens scratching faintly across paper. But even their notes betrayed the truth. They were writing not facts, but epitaphs. Trump's hands lay on the desk, limp at first, then curling slowly into fists. The nails bit into his palms, his knuckles whitening, but it was no gesture of defiance. It was a reflex, the body tightening against a storm it could not withstand. His jaw twitched, a muscle spasming beneath the skin, as if rage still lurked somewhere deep inside. But it never reached his lips, never found its way into words. For the first time in his life, silence was not a tactic. It was a prison. Every second of stillness stretched like eternity. The chamber had become a crucible, burning him in the fire of evidence, stripping away the armor he had worn for decades. He sat with shoulders slumped, eyes vacant, and in that posture, the truth screamed louder than any denial ever could. The man who had never accepted defeat was sitting in its grip, powerless, exposed. The lawmakers shifted once more, but this time their movements were slower, heavier. There was no energy left in the room to fuel disbelief. The shock had passed. What remained was the grim acceptance of reality. They had seen history change in an instant, and they knew it. The chamber would never be the same again. Neither would the man who sat broken at its center. The gavel's echo still hung in the air, its final strike reverberating through the bones of the chamber, through the hearts of everyone inside. The chairman's words lingered, carved into the silence. The truth has been proven. No one has the right to deny it. That truth stood taller than the flags, heavier than the walls, immovable as stone. And Trump, once the loudest voice in the room, sat drowned beneath it. His arrogance had evaporated, his swagger disintegrated. What remained was a hollow gaze, and the husk of a man who had built his empire on denial, now crushed by undeniable proof. The silence roared louder than his greatest speeches. The stillness was more damning than the angriest of rants. And as the chamber bore witness, Donald J. Trump sat motionless, his empty eyes the only confession he would ever give. The chamber had been silent under the crushing weight of the chairman's verdict, but silence never lasts in a room filled with lawmakers. The stillness cracked, then shattered, replaced by a surge of voices that burst out like a dam giving way. What had been a suffocating pause of disbelief now became a torrent of fury, outrage, and disbelief all tangled together. Desks rattled under the pounding of fists. Papers fluttered in the air as hands waved wildly, each senator fighting to be heard above the din. The chamber was no longer a place of order. It was a storm, and every voice was a bolt of thunder aimed at the man who sat hollow and unblinking in his chair. One senator, his face flushed red with anger, rose so quickly his chair toppled backward. His voice rang out over the clamor, sharp as a whip. He built his power on the illusion of bloodline. He paraded an heir, a so-called legacy, to fortify his political empire. He lied to us, he lied to the people, and he weaponized his own family. The words carried like a hammer blow, slamming into the ears of every person present. It was not simply an accusation, it was an indictment, laid bare in front of the man who had crafted his image on deception. Around the chamber, heads nodded, lips tightened, and eyes narrowed as the truth behind the statement seeped deeper. The fury spread like fire. Another senator surged to his feet, his voice rough with disbelief, almost breaking under the weight of the question he hurled. If even blood can be twisted into a tool, then what is left to trust? If lineage is just another con, then tell me, what in this man's story has ever been true? His words echoed high against the marble ceiling, ricocheting around the chamber like a challenge no one could ignore. The question was not just for Trump, it was for the entire nation, a blade slicing through the illusions that had held sway for years. Murmurs rippled across the room, deep gasps breaking through the air, as though the chamber itself recoiled from the implications. The lawmakers turned on each other, their arguments overlapping like crashing waves. Some demanded answers, shouting that every record tied to Trump's legacy must be re-examined. Others pounded on their desks, their outrage fueled by the betrayal of having been lied to so brazenly. For years, they had tolerated his bluster, his arrogance, his bending of the truth. But this was something different. This was no spin of politics, no exaggeration of achievements. This was blood, lineage, family, manipulated, twisted, and forged into a weapon of power. And that, to them, was unforgivable. The volume grew until it felt deafening. Voices rose, voices fell, but the energy only climbed higher, spiraling toward chaos. The chamber, once heavy with silence, now shook with fury. Reporters in the gallery clutched their pens in disbelief, scribbling furiously, but even they struggled to keep pace with the eruption. The very walls seemed to reverberate with the sheer force of anger, the betrayal cutting so deep it stripped away every ounce of civility. It was not debate, it was outrage made flesh. And yet, amidst the storm, Jasmine remained unmoved. She stood where she was, calm and unshaken, her presence a pillar against the torrent. Her eyes traveled across the chaos, across the shouting men and women who hurled their words like weapons. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When she finally spoke, her tone cut through the uproar like steel through cloth. Her calm was sharper than the loudest cry, her restraint more commanding than any roar of fury. A nation cannot stand on the scaffolding of a family's lies, she declared. The words hung in the air, slicing the chamber into silence. Her voice was firm, steady, deliberate, carrying with it the weight of certainty that no one could shake. She did not need volume. She had conviction. And conviction is a louder sound than any scream. She let the silence stretch for a breath, her gaze sweeping across the chamber, meeting the eyes of every senator who dared look back at her. Then she drove the point deeper. If the bedrock of truth is shattered in the most intimate bond, the bond of parent to child, then every promise, every oath sworn to the people is already broken. The words landed with devastating clarity. They were not rhetorical flourishes. They were reality, spoken plainly, stripped of ornament. The chamber trembled under their weight. Lawmakers who had moments ago shouted with fire now sat in heavy silence. forced to confront the enormity of her truth. The image of Trump, once untouchable, once the very symbol of raw, unshakable confidence, now lay in ruins. And Jasmine's words made it impossible to rebuild. One senator lowered his head, his jaw clenched tight, as though swallowing the bitter pill of realization. Another tapped his pen against the desk, slowly, nervously, the only sound in a room now devoid of the storm's chaos. The calm was not peace, it was resignation, a collective acknowledgement that what Jasmine had said could not be refuted. The fire of anger had been quenched not by exhaustion, but by truth. Trump himself sat as though carved from stone, his hollow eyes fixed on the desk before him. The shouting, the accusations, the questions, they had all washed over him, but Jasmine's words pierced straight through. He could not look up. He could not speak. His silence was louder than any protest. The lawmakers, too, felt the weight of that silence. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, as though Jasmine's words had pinned them to their own complicity. They had believed him. They had defended him. They had stood behind the myth of an heir, of a legacy, of a dynasty. And now they were forced to reckon with the fact that they had built their defense on lies as fragile as smoke. Jasmine stood motionless, letting her words breathe, letting the silence after them carve itself into the bones of the chamber. She did not look triumphant. She did not look smug. She looked resolute, a figure carved in truth, reminding them all of the line that had been crossed. The storm had broken, the chamber was still, and Jasmine's words, simple but unyielding, were the only sound that remained. The weight of Jasmine's words still pressed down on the chamber like a physical force. The silence after her declaration had been so complete that even the scrape of a shoe on marble felt like thunder. Every senator, every aide, every observer seemed locked in place, unable to break the spell of what they had just seen. The silence was not empty. It was loaded, brimming with the inevitability of what had to come next. And then, in the very heart of that stillness, something began to shift. It was not sudden. It was not loud. But it was undeniable. Lawmakers leaned toward each other, whispered words, scribbled notes. Eyes narrowed, heads nodded. The first ripples of decision-making began to spread. This was no longer just a scandal to be debated. It had become a wound on the nation's integrity that demanded to be dissected, cleaned, and laid bare. The chairman struck the gavel again, but this time the sound was not a command for silence. It was a summons for action. His voice, steady and solemn, carried across the chamber. A special committee would be established, empowered with full authority to investigate every transaction, every asset, every financial maneuver tied to the cover-up. The words cracked through the air like lightning. They were not a suggestion, not a possibility. They were an order written into history. The chamber reacted like a body inhaling after being held underwater. Some senators slammed their palms down in approval, voices raised in agreement, demanding the process move immediately. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, reluctant, their eyes darting to the ground or the ceiling rather than facing the judgment bearing down on them. There was no escape. The machinery of accountability had begun to turn, and it would grind down anything in its path. For those who had stood by Trump, the moment was excruciating. The men and women who had once defended him with fiery speeches, who had staked their reputations on his name, now sat like statues carved from shame. They did not rise. They did not speak. Some rested their foreheads in their palms, fingers gripping their hair as if to shield themselves from the searing light of exposure. Others stared fixedly at their desks, refusing to meet the gaze of colleagues who now regarded them with contempt. One senator who had previously declared Trump a man of unmatched honor sat slumped, his shoulders hunched so low it seemed he wanted to vanish into the wood. Another who had defended Trump during every scandal that came before clenched his jaw so tightly a vein pulsed along his temple. But still he said nothing. Their silence was louder than their words had ever been. Silence had become confession. The room vibrated with dual energies, outrage and humiliation. Outrage that such deceit had been woven into the highest levels of politics. Humiliation that so many had been willing accomplices, whether out of loyalty, fear, or ambition. It was not just Trump who had been exposed. It was the system of silence that had cocooned him, now cracked open and bleeding. And in the middle of that wreckage stood Jasmine. She did not speak further. She did not need to. Her silence was not shame. It was strength. Her eyes were clear, her posture unyielding, her presence a reminder that the storm had not broken her, it had elevated her. Where Trump had collapsed under the weight of truth, Jasmine had stood firm, and in doing so, she had become more than just the woman who brought the evidence. She had become a symbol. Her colleagues looked at her differently now, some with admiration, others with envy, still others with unease. She had proven incorruptible, and incorruptibility is a dangerous thing in a world built on compromises. To some, she was the embodiment of courage. To others, she was a threat. And Jasmine, though silent, felt both truths pressing in on her. She could sense the eyes watching her, not just with respect, but with calculation. For every ally her words had earned, they had also painted a target on her back. The creation of the committee was not just a procedural step. It was a gauntlet thrown into the arena of American politics. Already names were being whispered as potential members, men and women who would carry the task of unraveling decades of financial entanglements and shadow deals. The scope would be massive, sprawling through banks, hospitals, private accounts, and offshore havens. And each revelation would ripple outward, shaking the pillars of power one after another. But even as the machinery of justice lurched forward, the backlash had already begun to brew. Jasmine could see it in the narrowed eyes of the opposition, the clenched jaws, the quiet scribbling of notes passed down the row. They were not defeated. They were regrouping. They would not fight the truth head-on. They could not. Instead, they would fight her. It was a pattern as old as politics. When you cannot kill the evidence, you try to kill the messenger. Jasmine knew it. She had lived long enough in the trenches of government to recognize the shift in the air. Respect and admiration were intoxicating, but they came with shadows, with knives hidden behind smiles. Still, in that moment, she did not waver. She stood taller, not with triumph, but with resolve. She had not come to bask in glory. She had come to tear away lies, and she had done it. Whatever storm awaited her, she would face it the same way she had faced Trump, unflinching, unafraid, unbreakable. The chamber reflected this dual truth. On one side, there was relief, the sense that justice had been set in motion, that no matter how tangled the web, it would now be unraveled. On the other side, there was fear, a recognition that exposing the truth had consequences that would not end in that room. The machinery of accountability had been set loose, and it would not stop at Trump alone. As the resolution for the committee passed through the chamber, pens scratched furiously, aides whispered into phones, and senators leaned into huddled conversations. History was not just unfolding, it was accelerating. The first domino had fallen, and the rest trembled in its wake. Jasmine watched quietly, her face calm, her eyes resolute. The chamber was alive with movement, voices, decisions. But inside herself, she held to a simple truth. No matter how loud the storm, truth was louder. She had not merely presented evidence. She had redefined the battlefield. And though the room was charged with fury, humiliation, and resolve, every person present knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end. This was the beginning. The chamber was still buzzing with the echoes of heated arguments, the decision for investigation, the silence of fallen defenders, and the weight of Jasmine's resolve. Yet beneath it all, there was a sense that the storm was reaching its final crescendo, that one last word remained to be spoken, one final blade of truth that would cut clean through the air. The moment called for closure, not in whispers or murmurs, but in a statement that would outlive the chamber itself. Every face turned once more toward Jasmine, the woman who had brought this room, this man, and this nation to the brink of reckoning. She took a single step forward, the scrape of her shoe on the marble loud enough to draw the silence tighter around her. Her eyes swept the chamber, past the bowed heads of Trump's former defenders, past the clenched jaws of her enemies, past the wide, searching eyes of those who wanted desperately to believe that the truth could still matter. Her voice, when it came, carried not rage, not triumph, but something far heavier: conviction. "Honor does not live in blood," she said, her words deliberate, her tone steady and unyielding. "It lives in the truth we leave for the generations that come after us." The words fell like stones into a still lake, sending ripples outward that touched every soul in the room. They were not rhetoric. They were not grandstanding. They were the kind of words that lodged themselves deep into memory, the kind that lawmakers would repeat in their homes, that reporters would carve into headlines, that history itself would etch into its pages. For a heartbeat, the chamber was utterly still, as though even the air was holding its breath to absorb what had just been spoken. Then it began. First a clap, sharp and solitary, then another, then a wave. Within seconds, the chamber was filled with applause, not scattered or uncertain, but united. Senators rose to their feet, one after another, until the entire hall stood as one, their hands striking together in a rhythm that shook the very foundation of the room. The sound was thunderous, a rare and almost impossible moment of unity in a place so often divided. It was not applause for politics. It was not applause for victory over an opponent. It was applause for truth, for the unvarnished, undeniable, unshakable truth that Jasmine had held up against the most powerful man in the room and refused to let fall. Their faces told the story: admiration, respect, relief. In that moment, they were not divided by party or ideology. They were bound together by the recognition of something larger than themselves. Trump did not move. He sat slumped in his chair, his hands limp on the desk, his eyes hollow and unfocused. The applause washed over him, but did not touch him. The man who had once commanded every room he entered, who had thrived on spectacle and dominance, now sat small, diminished, a shell of arrogance collapsed under the crushing weight of truth. The noise around him might as well have been silence, for he had no part in it anymore. His reign in that chamber had ended, not with a roar, but with stillness. Jasmine, however, stood tall. The applause was for her, but she did not bask in it. She did not smile, did not bow, did not let triumph soften her stance. She let the clapping continue, let it roll through the chamber like a storm breaking at last. But she remained as she had been from the start: calm, resolute, unwavering. She was not there for applause. She was there for truth, and that truth now echoed louder than any ovation. When the sound finally began to ebb, Jasmine turned. She gathered her folder, no longer needed, for its contents had already seared themselves into history, and held it at her side. She lifted her chin, her posture straight, her gaze steady. Then, without hesitation, she walked toward the chamber doors. Each step seemed to reverberate, not just across the marble floor, but into the very bones of those who watched. She was not retreating. She was not leaving in defeat. She was ascending, carrying with her the weight of justice. The sight was unforgettable. Trump sat alone, unmoving, a man caged by his own silence. The lawmaker still stood, watching the woman who had just dismantled a lie that had stood for decades. And Jasmine walked forward, her head high, her stride firm, her figure cutting through the chamber like a symbol carved in stone. She was no longer just a congresswoman. She was no longer just a voice in a hearing. She was the embodiment of justice, the proof that truth, when wielded with courage, could still stand taller than power. The doors opened, the light of the hallway spilling into the chamber. For a moment, her silhouette was framed against it, stark and commanding, a figure of defiance and hope in equal measure. Then she stepped through, vanishing from the chamber, but not from their memory. Behind her, the applause rekindled, softer now but still strong, as though the chamber itself was reluctant to let her go without giving her the send-off she deserved. The story did not need narration. It had written itself in the gas, in the fury, in the silence, in the thunder of applause. Trump sat as the ruin of arrogance, while Jasmine left as the legacy of truth. And so the hearing ended, not with another outburst, not with chaos, but with a vision burned into every mind present. A disgraced man sinking into silence, and a woman walking out as a symbol, her words still echoing. Honor does not live in blood. It lives in the truth we leave for the generations that come after us. That single line lingered long after the applause faded, long after the chamber emptied. It was a line that would be repeated, printed, etched into the annals of history. And for everyone who had been there, it was the moment they realized they had not just witnessed a hearing, they had witnessed history itself. The chamber doors closed behind Jasmine, and the echoes of her final words lingered in the marble halls long after her footsteps faded. History had been made, but history is never only about one day, one scandal, or one man. It is about the lessons left behind when the noise has died and the dust has settled. What remained in that room was not just the image of Trump silenced or Jasmine rising as a symbol. What remained was the deeper question that her fight had forced everyone to confront. What is honor, and where does truth truly live? That was the heartbeat that carried beyond the chamber, a pulse demanding to be felt by all who had witnessed, all who would hear, and all who would live in the shadow of this story. The lesson was raw, brutal, and undeniable. Power built on lies is a house of glass. It may gleam, it may tower, but the moment truth strikes, it shatters. For years, Trump had weaponized the myth of legacy, painting himself as the patriarch of an unbreakable dynasty. But when that myth was stripped away, what was left was not strength, it was emptiness. Jasmine's fight had proved something elemental. Honor is not inherited, it is earned. Blood can carry DNA, but it cannot carry truth. Truth stands alone, untouched by wealth, unaffected by power, and unbent by manipulation. That was the first and sharpest lesson of the hearing. And there was another just as searing. Silence is complicity. The lawmakers who had bowed their heads, who had defended lies for years, were not innocent. Their silence had been a shield for corruption, their loyalty a leash tied around the nation's throat. But in the moment truth exploded into the chamber, their silence revealed itself for what it truly was: guilt. The human lesson was clear. If you see deceit and do nothing, you are not neutral, you are part of the lie. Jasmine's resolve showed the opposite. She did not stay silent. She stepped into the fire. And by doing so, she forced truth into the light where no silence could smother it again. The message spread further, beyond politics, beyond parties. Families, teachers, leaders of every kind could see it reflected in their own lives. The most dangerous lies are not the ones we tell to others, but the ones we build into legacies, into identities, into the very foundations of who we claim to be. Trump had tried to craft a legacy on falsehoods, but Jasmine had proved that no dynasty forged in lies can outlast a single truth. The story was bigger than one man or one woman. It was about what we pass forward, what we teach our children, what we leave in the bones of the future. And the lesson was carved sharp. Legacy means nothing if it is not built on truth. Jasmine's words became more than a closing statement. They became a creed. Honor does not live in blood. It lives in the truth we leave for the generations that come after us. That line was repeated in editorials, whispered in classrooms, carved into speeches by those who saw its weight. It was a message that cut across age, ideology, and borders, because at its heart it was not about politics. It was about humanity. The drama of the hearing may have been a spectacle, but the truth it uncovered was simple and universal. Every lie is temporary, but truth is forever. There was also a warning woven into the lesson, sharp as broken glass. Lies do not only collapse on those who tell them, they crush everyone who leans on them. Trump's allies, his defenders, his entire structure of power had crumbled alongside him. When the myth of bloodline cracked, it dragged down all who clung to it. The message to the world was brutal but clear. If you chain yourself to a lie, you will sink with it. Jasmine's defiance had saved her from that fate. But her example was also a caution. It is not enough to hope truth will rise. You must stand with it, even when it is dangerous, even when the cost is high. And perhaps the deepest lesson was this: courage is contagious. Jasmine did not come into the chamber with an army. She did not have numbers on her side. She had only evidence, conviction, and the refusal to be silenced. But in wielding them, she sparked something in the hearts of those who watched. The applause that shook the room was not just for her victory, it was for the reminder that one voice, steady and unyielding, can move the weight of an entire nation. That is the kind of lesson that outlives the scandal, that plants itself in the soil of memory and grows into something stronger. The story, when stripped of names and power, boiled down to a lesson every human being could feel in their bones. Lies demand silence, but truth demands courage. Trump's downfall was not simply political, it was human. His arrogance, his reliance on deception, his obsession with legacy without substance, all of it collapsed because it was hollow. Jasmine's triumph was not political either. It was human. It was the triumph of courage over fear, of truth over silence, of integrity over spectacle. And that is why the chamber stood, why the applause rose, why her words carved themselves into history. For the generations to come, the lesson was laid out in fire. Do not mistake inheritance for honor. Do not mistake silence for neutrality. Do not mistake fear for safety. Honor is built choice by choice, truth by truth, moment by moment. And when the time comes to stand, stand, even if your knees shake, even if your voice trembles, even if the entire room glares at you with hate, because one truth spoken aloud can topple 1,000 lies whispered in the dark. That was the message Jasmine left behind. In the end, the hearing was more than a trial of one man. It was a mirror held up to a nation, a reminder of what happens when we allow lies to grow fat on silence. But it was also a beacon, a flare in the dark, showing what is possible when even one person refuses to bend. Jasmine had walked out of the chamber not just as a symbol of justice, but as a living proof of what courage and truth can accomplish. And the final lesson, the one that lingered when the applause faded and the door shut, was this: power is temporary, but truth is eternal. Trump had wielded power, but Jasmine had wielded truth. And in the end, truth was the only weapon that mattered. And if truth is more than a verdict, it's a verb. So now we move. Stand up today, call your representatives and say, subpoena everything, protect every record, shield every whistleblower. No exceptions. Show up at town halls, write the letters, flood the phone lines, and demand ironclad laws that outlaw hush money contracts in medical and public institutions. Donate to watchdogs, vote in every election, local, state, national, and make transparency a litmus test for your support, because silence is how rot returns. Refuse cynicism. Organize your block, your workplace, your classroom. Build rapid response groups that document, archive, and report, so no truth can be buried by money or muscle. And if your leaders shrug, replace them. Register friends, canvass doors, and turn outrage into turnout until accountability is not a headline, but a habit. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.